Mrs. Henderson, that was inappropriate. I'd like to give you a chance to apologize.
Excuse me? A chance?
The classroom was silent except for the sound of Mrs. Patricia Henderson's voice as she stood at the front of the room, asking her fourth-grade class a question about American history. Specifically, about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Several hands shot up immediately, eager 9- and 10-year-olds wanting to show what they knew. But there was one hand that Mrs. Henderson seemed determined not to see. The hand belonging to Maya Richardson, a quiet, observant black girl sitting in the third row, her arm raised high, her eyes focused and ready. Mrs. Henderson's gaze swept across the room, landing on a blonde girl in the front row. Then a red-haired boy by the window. Then another white student near the back. Each gave partial answers, some barely coherent, and each time Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly, encouraging them with phrases like, "Wonderful effort," and "You're on the right track, sweetheart." Maya's hand remained up. Still, Mrs. Henderson didn't call on her. A few students began to notice, exchanging glances. Maya's best friend Sophie Chin shifted uncomfortably in her seat, watching the scene unfold with growing frustration. Finally, after the fourth student had stumbled through an incomplete answer, Mrs. Henderson sighed as if resigned and said Maya's name. Just her name. No warmth, no encouragement. Just Maya. And Maya spoke. Her voice was clear, confident, and what came out of her mouth was nothing short of extraordinary for a 9-year-old. She explained how Harriet Tubman had made 13 missions to rescue approximately 70 enslaved people using the network of anti-slavery activists and safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. She detailed the specific routes Tubman used, the coding systems embedded in quilts and spirituals, the astronomical navigation techniques Tubman employed to travel by night. She spoke about Tubman's work as a Union spy during the Civil War, her role in the Combahee River raid that liberated more than 700 slaves, and how Tubman later became a suffragist fighting for women's right to vote. Maya even mentioned the recent decision to feature Tubman on the $20 bill, connecting historical significance to contemporary recognition. The classroom was stunned into silence. Even the students who had been doodling in their notebooks looked up. This wasn't just a good answer. This was the kind of answer you'd expect from a college history major, not a fourth grader at Westbrook Academy. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, looking at Maya with something that wasn't quite suspicion but wasn't quite respect either. Then she said the words that would change everything. "That's a very rehearsed answer, Maya. Did your parents help you with that? Or perhaps you found it online?" The silence in the classroom became heavy, oppressive. Several students audibly gasped. Sophie's mouth fell open in disbelief. A few of the white students looked down at their desks, suddenly very interested in their pencils. Maya's expression shifted from pride to hurt, confusion flickering across her young face. But then something else emerged. Something calm. Something knowing. Something almost dangerous in its composure. Maya looked directly at Mrs. Henderson and said quietly but firmly, "Mrs. Henderson, that was inappropriate. I'd like to give you a chance to apologize." Mrs. Henderson actually laughed. A short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Excuse me? A chance?" Maya didn't blink. "Yes, ma'am. A chance." And there it was. A 9-year-old girl, sitting in her desk with perfect posture, looking at her teacher with an expression that was far too controlled, far too strategic for someone her age. Mrs. Henderson stared back, clearly thrown off balance by the calm authority in Maya's voice. The other students looked between them like spectators at a tennis match, sensing they were witnessing something significant but not quite understanding what. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know, what nobody in that classroom knew except Maya herself, was that this wasn't the first incident. This wasn't even the 7th. And Maya Richardson wasn't just any 9-year-old. But we'll get to that. First, let's go back 6 hours earlier to understand exactly who Maya Richardson really is. The morning had started like most mornings in the Richardson household. Maya's alarm went off at 6:30, and she was already awake, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling of her bedroom. Her room wasn't what you'd expect from a child of extraordinary wealth. There were no designer toys scattered about, no princess-themed decorations or expensive gaming systems. Instead, the room looked like it belonged to a young scientist. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with everything from children's novels to books on quantum physics, marine biology and coding. A partially completed robotics project sat on her desk next to a microscope. Sketches of invention ideas were pinned to a corkboard. Star charts covered part of the ceiling. This was the room of a girl whose mind never stopped working. Maya got up, dressed in her Westbrook Academy uniform, a navy blazer, white shirt and plaid skirt, and headed downstairs. The Richardson home was beautiful, elegant, but not ostentatious. You could tell the family had money, but they weren't the type to flaunt it. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls, and Maya's mother, Dr. Claudia Richardson, was already there, reviewing something on her tablet while sipping from a delicate porcelain cup. Claudia Richardson was striking. Early 40s, with natural hair pulled back in an elegant twist, warm brown skin, and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a neurosurgeon before stepping back to focus on philanthropy and raising her children, but she still volunteered at the local hospital 3 days a week. She looked up when Maya entered and smiled, but Maya could see the concern in her mother's eyes. They sat down to breakfast together and Claudia asked how school was going. Maya, buttering a piece of toast, said it was fine. Just fine. Claudia pressed a little, noting that Maya had seemed quieter lately, more withdrawn. Was everything okay with her friends? With her classes? Maya deflected smoothly, the way she'd been practicing. She changed the subject to the book she was reading, a college-level text on quantum entanglement that she'd borrowed from her father's library. She asked her mother questions about particle behavior, and Claudia, proud of her daughter's brilliant mind, allowed herself to be distracted. During their conversation, Claudia mentioned that Maya's father was in a morning meeting in Singapore. Marcus Richardson, Maya's dad, was frequently traveling for business. He'd built Richardson Technologies from absolutely nothing, starting in a garage 15 years ago with just an idea and determination. Now the company was worth $8 billion, specializing in artificial intelligence and sustainable technology solutions. He was one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in the country, though he kept a relatively low profile, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Maya thought about her father as she ate her breakfast. She thought about how hard he'd worked to build something meaningful. How he'd faced discrimination, doubt, and closed doors but pushed through anyway. How he'd taught her that being underestimated could be an advantage if you were smart about it. She wanted to be like him. Strong. Strategic. Able to handle her own problems without running to her parents every time something went wrong. And things had been going wrong at school. For months now. But Maya hadn't told her parents. She wanted to prove she could handle it herself. She wanted to be strong. After breakfast, Maya grabbed her backpack, heavy with books and her tablet, and headed outside where James was waiting by the car. James had been the Richardson family driver for 20 years, since before Maya was born. He was in his early 60s, a black man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. But he was more than just a driver. He was family. He taught Maya to ride a bike. He'd been there for her first day of kindergarten. He knew her better than almost anyone. As Maya slid into the back seat, James caught her eye in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything at first, just started the car and pulled out of the circular driveway. But a few minutes into the drive he spoke. His voice was gentle but knowing. He asked if Maya remembered what her grandmother used to say. Maya's grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, but her words still echoed in Maya's mind constantly. Maya recited the saying softly, "Stand tall, speak truth, but choose your battles wisely." James nodded, watching her in the mirror. He asked the follow-up question, the second part of her grandmother's wisdom. "And when you choose that battle?" Maya smiled just a little. "Fight to win." James smiled back, but there was concern in his expression. He could tell something was weighing on Maya. He'd known her long enough to read the subtle signs. The way she was quieter than usual. The way her shoulders carried tension that no 9-year-old should have. But he also knew Maya well enough to know she'd talk when she was ready. So he didn't push. He just drove, letting her know through his presence that he was there if she needed him. The car pulled up to Westbrook Academy, and Maya's stomach tightened slightly. Westbrook was one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. Tuition was $45,000 a year. The campus looked like a small college, with brick buildings covered in ivy, manicured lawns, and facilities that most public schools could only dream of. The student body was predominantly white, with a handful of Asian students and even fewer Black and Latino students. Maya was one of maybe 10 Black kids in the entire school. She thanked James and got out of the car, adjusting her backpack on her shoulders. The moment she walked through the front doors, she felt it. That subtle shift in atmosphere that she'd become so familiar with. The weight of being watched, of being different, of having to represent excellence every single day just to be seen as equal. Within seconds, her best friend Sophie Chin found her. Sophie was a whirlwind of energy, her long black hair in a ponytail, her backpack covered in pins from various anime shows and science museums. Sophie took one look at Maya's face and immediately knew something was wrong. She'd known Maya since first grade and they'd been inseparable ever since. Sophie asked what was up, her voice full of concern. But before Maya could respond, they reached Maya's locker. And Maya stopped dead in her tracks. Someone had vandalized it. A crude, racist drawing had been scrawled across the front in permanent marker. It wasn't the first time. It was the third time this month. Maya's jaw tightened, but her expression remained calm. Almost eerily calm. Sophie exploded with outrage. She wanted to march straight to the principal's office. She wanted to find out who did it and make them pay. She was ready to go to war right then and there. But Maya stopped her. Maya pulled out her phone, took several clear photos of the vandalism from different angles, and then calmly opened her locker to retrieve the cleaning wipes she now kept specifically for this purpose. She cleaned off the drawing without saying a word, her movements methodical and controlled. Sophie watched in frustrated disbelief and asked why Maya wasn't reporting this. Maya's response was simple and chilling, "Not yet." The hallway was filling up with students now. Jenny Morrison walked by, a white girl with kind eyes and an apologetic smile. Jenny came from old money, the type of family that had buildings named after them. She saw the tail end of what Maya was doing and looked guilty, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. She settled for a quiet good morning that sounded more like an apology. Tyler Banks was at his own locker nearby. Tyler was a 10-year-old black student, tall for his age, with a guarded expression that suggested he'd learned early not to trust too easily. He was at Westbrook on a full scholarship, a fact that some students and even some teachers never let him forget. He glanced at Maya and their eyes met briefly. There was understanding there. Recognition. They didn't speak but they didn't need to. They both knew what it was like to navigate this space. Brock Wellington swaggered past with his entourage. Brock was the son of a state senator, blonde, athletic, and possessed of the particular arrogance that comes from never having been told no. He smirked at Maya as he passed, and while he didn't say anything, the implication was clear. Maya didn't react. She just closed her locker and headed to class. First period was English, and Mrs. Anderson was one of the better teachers. She treated all her students fairly, encouraged diverse perspectives, and created a classroom environment where Maya actually felt comfortable participating. But second period was different. Second period was history with Mrs. Patricia Henderson. Maya and Sophie walked into the classroom together, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Mrs. Henderson was writing something on the board, her back to the students as they filed in. She was a white woman in her late 50s, with short brown hair styled in a practical bob and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She'd been teaching at Westbrook for 30 years and had a reputation as a no-nonsense educator who demanded respect and didn't tolerate disruption. What she also had was a pattern of behavior that Maya had been documenting for months. Students took their seats. Maya sat in the third row, Sophie next to her. Tyler was a few seats back. Jenny was near the front. Brock and his friends clustered near the window, already whispering and laughing about something. Class began, and immediately Maya noticed the patterns she'd seen so many times before. Mrs. Henderson asked a question about the Revolutionary War. A white student named Brandon raised his hand and gave an answer that was barely coherent, mixing up the French and Indian War with the Revolution itself. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly and said, "Wonderful effort, Brandon. You're thinking in the right direction. Can anyone help Brandon out?" Another white student, Emily, raised her hand and gave a partially correct answer. Mrs. Henderson praised her effusively, calling her brilliant and insightful, even though the answer was fairly basic. Then Tyler raised his hand. Mrs. Henderson called on him, but her tone was different. Flatter. When Tyler gave a completely correct and well-articulated answer, Mrs. Henderson simply nodded and said, "Adequate," before moving on. Maya watched this happen. Sophie watched it happen. Even some of the white students noticed the difference in treatment and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one said anything. They never did. The pattern continued throughout the class. White students were praised for mediocre work. Black students were scrutinized more harshly. When Jenny gave a wrong answer, Mrs. Henderson gently guided her to the right one. When Tyler made a minor error, Mrs. Henderson corrected him sharply and moved on without the same supportive guidance. Maya was taking mental notes, adding to the growing file in her mind. She'd been documenting these incidents for months. Every slight, every microaggression, every moment of differential treatment. She had dates, times, witnesses, and now recordings. Her smartwatch had a voice recording feature, and while she knew she was in a one-party consent state where she could legally record conversations she was part of, she'd been careful about when and how she used it. Sophie leaned over and whispered to Maya, asking how much longer she was going to let this go. Maya whispered back, until I have everything I need. Sophie looked at her friend with a mixture of admiration and concern. She knew Maya was planning something, but she didn't know what. Maya had always been the strategic one in their friendship. The one who thought 10 steps ahead. The one who played the long game. And then came the moment that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson announced they'd be discussing Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. She asked a question, hands went up, and the pattern Maya had been witnessing all semester played out in real time. Mrs. Henderson ignored Maya's raised hand. Called on white students. Praised inadequate answers. And finally, reluctantly, called on Maya. What happened next you already know. Maya's brilliant answer. Mrs. Henderson's accusatory response. The silence that fell over the classroom. And Maya's calm, devastating reply. Mrs. Henderson, that was inappropriate. I'd like to give you a chance to apologize. Some of the students looked shocked. Others looked scared. Tyler sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes wide. Sophie grabbed Maya's hand under the desk, squeezing it in support. Jenny looked between Maya and Mrs. Henderson, conflict clear on her face. Mrs. Henderson laughed, but it was a nervous laugh now. She repeated Maya's words back to her with disbelief. Excuse me? A chance. And Maya, with the composure of someone far beyond her 9 years, simply said, Yes, ma'am. A chance. The bell rang, breaking the tension. Students gathered their things, but the atmosphere was electric. Everyone was talking in hushed voices about what had just happened. Did a fourth grader really just call out a teacher like that? Who did Maya Richardson think she was? If only they knew. As students filed out, Sophie grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her aside in the hallway. She asked what Maya was doing, if she'd lost her mind. Maya just shook her head and said it was time. Sophie asked time for what, and Maya looked at her friend with an expression that was somehow both young and ancient. She said, Time to choose my battle. And fight to win. Before we continue with what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something was wrong, where you were being treated unfairly, but you didn't know how to fix it? Have you ever had to decide between staying silent to keep the peace or speaking up and facing the consequences? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because Maya's story is just getting started, and what she does next will surprise you. But here's what you need to understand about Maya Richardson. This 9-year-old girl wasn't just smart. She wasn't just brave. She was strategic. She'd been raised by 2 parents who had fought their own battles against systemic racism and won. Her father had built an empire from nothing. Her mother had been one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the country. They taught Maya that injustice should never be accepted, but that fighting injustice required more than just anger. It required documentation, evidence, strategy, and perfect timing. 4 months, Maya had been enduring Mrs. Henderson's microaggressions. The subtle dismissals, the different standards, the undermining of her intelligence. And for months she'd been documenting every single incident. She had a journal at home with dates, times, exact quotes, and witnesses. She had recordings on her smartwatch. She had photos of her vandalized locker. She had everything she needed to build an airtight case. But Maya hadn't told her parents. Not yet. Because Maya wanted to try something first. She wanted to give the system a chance to work. She wanted to see if Mrs. Henderson, if given the opportunity to recognize her behavior and apologize, would do the right thing. And she wanted to see if the school administration, if alerted to a problem, would address it properly. That's why she'd given Mrs. Henderson a chance to apologize. That's why she documented everything so carefully. Because Maya understood something that many adults never learn. Hope for the best but prepare for the worst. The confrontation in the classroom was just the beginning. Maya had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped now. And Mrs. Henderson, the principal, and everyone at Westbrook Academy was about to learn a very important lesson. Never underestimate a 9-year-old girl who knows her worth. If you're loving this story so far and want to see how Maya takes on an entire school system, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. This is a story about courage, justice, and what happens when one brave child decides enough is enough. Now, let's talk about what happened after that classroom confrontation, because things were about to get very interesting very quickly. Within an hour of that classroom confrontation, Maya Richardson found herself sitting in Principal Robert Ashford's office. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a prestigious private school. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, diplomas and awards covering the walls, a large mahogany desk that seemed designed to intimidate. Principal Ashford sat behind that desk, a white man in his early 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had the look of someone who'd spent his entire career in education, climbing the administrative ladder, careful never to rock the boat too much, always playing it safe. Mrs. Henderson sat in the chair next to Maya, and if Maya was composed, Mrs. Henderson was the opposite. She was agitated, defensive, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Her face was flushed and she kept adjusting her glasses, a nervous habit she'd probably had for years. She'd requested this meeting immediately after class, claiming that Maya had been disrespectful and disruptive, and that action needed to be taken. Principal Ashford looked between the 9-year-old girl and the veteran teacher, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He started the meeting the way administrators always start these meetings, with platitudes about Westbrook Academy's commitment to excellence and mutual respect. He spoke in that careful, measured tone that said absolutely nothing while taking a long time to say it. Then he asked Mrs. Henderson to explain what happened. And Mrs. Henderson didn't hold back. Her version of events painted Maya as a problem child, someone who questioned authority, who was disrespectful, who had created a disruption in the classroom by challenging a teacher's professional judgment. She talked about how Maya had accused her of inappropriate behavior in front of the entire class. How Maya had demanded an apology, as if a student had any right to demand anything from a teacher. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose as she spoke, indignation coloring every word. She talked about her 30 years of teaching experience, her dedication to her students, and how she'd never, in all her years, been treated with such disrespect by a child. Principal Ashford nodded along, making sympathetic noises, occasionally glancing at Maya, who sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. When Mrs. Henderson finished, there was a moment of silence. Principal Ashford cleared his throat and turned to Maya, his expression suggesting he expected an apology, an explanation, maybe tears. What he got instead was something entirely different. Maya spoke in a calm, clear voice. No emotion. Just facts. She recounted exactly what had happened in the classroom, word for word. She explained that she'd raised her hand to answer a question about Harriet Tubman. That Mrs. Henderson had ignored her repeatedly while calling on other students. That when she was finally called upon, she provided a comprehensive, accurate answer. That Mrs. Henderson had then implied Maya had cheated, suggesting her parents had helped her or that she'd copied the answer from the internet. Maya's recitation of events was precise, almost clinical. She didn't editorialize. She didn't add her feelings. She just stated the facts. Then Maya said something that made both adults in the room go very still. She said, "This is the 7th documented incident of differential treatment I've experienced in Mrs. Henderson's class." Principal Ashford blinked. 7th? Mrs. Henderson's face went from flushed to pale. Documented? Maya reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook. It was well-worn, the kind of journal you'd see a researcher use. She opened it, and even from across the desk, Principal Ashford could see pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. Dates, times, detailed descriptions, names of witnesses. Maya flipped to a specific page and began to read. September 23rd. Mrs. Henderson praised Emily Watson for a partially correct answer about the 3 branches of government, saying it was wonderfully insightful. When Tyler Banks gave a completely correct and more detailed answer to the same question, Mrs. Henderson responded with, "That's adequate," and moved on without praise. October 5th. During a group project assignment, Mrs. Henderson suggested that Maya might want to be the secretary for her group rather than the presenter, saying that Maya seemed more comfortable in supporting roles. When Maya asked why, Mrs. Henderson said some students are natural leaders, and some are better at detail work. October 18th. Maya answered a math problem correctly on the board. Mrs. Henderson checked her work 3 times and asked her to explain her reasoning before accepting the answer. When Brock Wellington answered the next problem, which was wrong, Mrs. Henderson simply corrected it and moved on without questioning his process. Maya went on and on. Each incident was detailed with the precision of a legal brief. Dates, times, exact quotes, witnesses present. The notebook was filled with them. Months of careful documentation. Months of a 9-year-old girl methodically recording every microaggression, every subtle dismissal, every moment of differential treatment. Principal Ashford's expression shifted from discomfort to alarm. This wasn't a simple student-teacher dispute. This was something else entirely. Something that could become a serious problem for the school. Mrs. Henderson, meanwhile, had gone from defensive to angry. She interrupted Maya, her voice sharp. This was ridiculous. She treated all her students the same. Maya was being oversensitive, reading racism into normal classroom management. Children these days were taught to see discrimination everywhere, even when it didn't exist. She was a dedicated educator who had given 30 years of her life to teaching, and she refused to be accused of prejudice by a child who clearly had been coached by her parents to play the victim. Principal Ashford tried to intervene to smooth things over. He used phrases like, "I'm sure we're all coming from a good place," and, "perhaps we're all a bit sensitive about these issues." He suggested that maybe there had been some misunderstandings, some misinterpretations. He spoke about the importance of assuming good intent. Maya let him finish. Then she looked directly at him and said, "Mr. Ashford, I'm not sensitive. I'm accurate." The words hung in the air. There was a steel in Maya's voice that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. She wasn't crying. She wasn't raising her voice. She was simply stating a fact. Principal Ashford shifted in his chair. He promised he would look into the matter. He'd review Maya's concerns carefully. He'd have conversations with staff. He'd ensure that all students felt supported and valued at Westbrook Academy. It was the standard institutional response. Lots of promises. No concrete action. The kind of response designed to make the problem go away without actually solving anything. Maya stood to leave, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. Mrs. Henderson looked relieved, probably thinking the meeting was over and she'd weathered the storm. Principal Ashford was already mentally composing the vague email he'd send to Maya's parents about addressing concerns and maintaining open dialogue. But then Maya turned back. She looked at Principal Ashford and said, "You have until Friday to address this properly. That gives you 3 days." Principal Ashford actually laughed, a surprised, nervous sound. He couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. A 9-year-old was giving him an ultimatum? He asked, confusion and a bit of condescension in his voice. "Or what, Maya?" Maya's response was simple and devastating. "Or I'll handle it myself. Have a good day, Mr. Ashford." And then she walked out, leaving 2 adults staring after her in stunned silence. The thing about Maya Richardson that no one at Westbrook Academy understood was that she'd been raised by 2 people who had built their entire lives on the principle that injustice unchallenged is injustice accepted. Her father had faced countless closed doors, countless investors who didn't believe a young black man from a working-class neighborhood could build a tech company. He documented every rejection, learned from every setback, and used every obstacle as fuel. Her mother had been one of a handful of black women in her neurosurgery program, had endured condescension and doubt, and had responded by being so undeniably excellent that she couldn't be ignored. They taught Maya that hoping for fairness wasn't enough. You had to demand it. But you had to demand it strategically, with evidence, with precision, with a plan. After school, Sophie came over to Maya's house for what they told their parents was a study session. James picked both girls up, and during the drive, Sophie kept looking at Maya with a mixture of awe and concern. She'd witnessed what had happened in the classroom, had heard whispers about the principal's office meeting, and she knew Maya well enough to know that something big was happening. The Richardson house revealed itself gradually as they drove up the long tree-lined driveway. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was clearly the home of people with significant wealth. Modern architecture blended with classic elegance. Large windows. Beautiful landscaping. A sense of space and privacy. Sophie had been to Maya's house before, but usually they stayed in Maya's room. Today was different. They went straight to Maya's bedroom, and once the door was closed, Sophie exploded with questions. What was Maya thinking, giving the principal an ultimatum? Did she have any idea how much trouble she could get in? What was her plan? Maya sat down at her desk, opened her laptop and said quietly, "I want to show you something." What Sophie saw over the next hour changed her understanding of her best friend completely. Maya didn't just have a notebook with written observations. She had an entire system. A digital folder on her computer labeled Documentation, with subfolders organized by date and type of incident. Voice recordings from her smartwatch, dozens of them capturing classroom interactions. Maya explained that she lived in a one-party consent state, meaning she could legally record conversations she was part of without the other person's knowledge. She'd been recording her classes for 3 months. Sophie listened to some of the recordings and even she was shocked by what she heard. The difference in Mrs. Henderson's tone when speaking to white students versus black students was undeniable when you heard it back to back. The warmth and encouragement for one group. The flatness and occasional hostility for the other. But it wasn't just about tone. Maya had documented patterns of behavior that went beyond individual incidents. She created spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets, tracking how often students of different races were called on, how their answers were received, how their work was graded. The data was damning. Over a 3-month period, white students in Mrs. Henderson's class were called on 63% more often than black students, despite black students raising their hands at similar rates. When white students gave incorrect answers, they received an average of 2.3 follow-up questions or hints to help them reach the correct answer. When black students gave incorrect answers, they received an average of 0.7 follow-up attempts before Mrs. Henderson moved on. Maya had documented incidents involving not just herself, but Tyler Banks and 2 other black students in the class. She'd noted patterns of lower grades on subjective assignments despite similar quality of work. She tracked disciplinary referrals and found that black students were far more likely to be sent to the principal's office for minor infractions that were overlooked when white students committed them. Sophie was overwhelmed. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. Maya's response was honest and heartbreaking. "I wasn't planning anything. I was hoping it would stop. But I was preparing in case it didn't." And there it was. The emotional core of Maya's experience. She was 9 years old. She wanted to just be a kid, to focus on her robotics projects and her books and her friendships. She didn't want to be a civil rights activist in 4th grade. But she also knew that staying silent didn't help anyone. It didn't help her. It didn't help Tyler. It didn't help the other black students who would come after her. She was scared, though she'd never let anyone see it. Scared of confrontation. Scared of making things worse. Scared of disappointing her parents. But more than fear, she felt responsibility. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind constantly: "Stand tall, speak truth, but choose your battles wisely." Maya had chosen her battle. Now she had to fight to win. Sophie asked the question that was weighing on both of them: "Are you going to tell your parents?" Maya hesitated. "Not yet. Adults always want to take over. I need to try first." Sophie pressed. "But your parents would believe you. They'd help you." Maya nodded. "I know. But I want to see if the system works first. I want to see if the principal will do the right thing when given the chance. If he doesn't..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. If the system failed, then Maya would bring in the big guns. That's when Sophie learned something she hadn't fully understood before. She knew Maya's parents were wealthy, knew they were successful, but she didn't know the full extent. Maya explained, partly to process her own thoughts and partly because she needed Sophie to understand the stakes. Marcus Richardson had built Richardson Technologies from absolutely nothing. 15 years ago he was working 2 jobs and building circuit boards in his garage, trying to develop more efficient AI processing chips. He faced rejection after rejection from investors. Banks wouldn't give him loans. Venture capitalists wouldn't return his calls. But he persisted, eventually getting a small angel investment from a historically black college that believed in his vision. He used that money to build a prototype that worked so well that he couldn't be ignored anymore. Within 5 years, Richardson Technologies was valued at $500 million. Within 10 years it was worth $5 billion. Now it was worth $8 billion and employed over 3,000 people. Marcus Richardson had used his wealth and influence carefully. He sat on the boards of several educational foundations. He donated millions to schools and STEM programs, particularly those serving underrepresented communities. And yes, he donated $2 million to Westbrook Academy last year, money that went toward a new science building and updated technology labs. Here's the twist that Sophie found almost unbelievable. The school had no idea that Maya Richardson, the quiet 4th grader in Mrs. Henderson's class, was Marcus Richardson's daughter. Maya used her mother's maiden name at school, Johnson. It was a decision her parents had made deliberately. They wanted Maya to be treated like any other student, not given special treatment because of her father's wealth and influence. They wanted her to navigate the world on her own merit, to understand what it was like to be judged without the protective shield of privilege. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. But now, as Maya faced discrimination at a school her father had literally helped build, the irony was almost painful. Sophie looked at her friend with new understanding. "Maya, if the school knew who your dad was..." Maya cut her off. "Then they'd treat me differently for the wrong reasons. I don't want special treatment because my dad is rich. I want basic respect because I'm a human being. There's a difference." Before we continue with what happened next, let me ask you something. If you were in Maya's position, would you have told your parents immediately? Or would you have tried to handle it yourself first? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this decision, this choice to fight her own battle before bringing in reinforcements, is about to have some serious consequences. Now, while Maya was preparing her case and trying to decide her next move, something else was happening across town. Mrs. Patricia Henderson was at home and she was spiraling. Mrs. Henderson lived in a modest but comfortable house in the suburbs with her husband, Frank, a retired police officer. The house was filled with photographs from their 35 years of marriage, pictures of their 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. There were also dozens of photos from Mrs. Henderson's teaching career, class pictures going back decades, awards for teaching excellence, thank you cards from former students. Mrs. Henderson had poured herself a glass of wine, which was unusual for a weeknight, and she was on the phone with her younger sister, Carol. The conversation revealed everything you needed to know about Mrs. Henderson's mindset. She was venting, her voice tight with frustration and defensiveness. She talked about Maya Richardson, about the accusation of inappropriate behavior, about the principal's office meeting. She told her sister that parents these days were so sensitive, that they taught their children to see racism in everything, that she'd been teaching for 30 years and had never had problems like this before. Carol, on the other end of the line, made sympathetic noises. She asked if Patricia thought the parents were going to make trouble. Mrs. Henderson said she didn't know, but that she treated all her students the same, had always treated all her students the same. It was her mantra, repeated multiple times throughout the conversation. I treat all the students the same. But then she said something revealing. She said that Maya Richardson made her uncomfortable. That the girl was always so serious, so watchful. That Maya looked at her sometimes with this expression like she was judging her, evaluating her, finding her wanting. Mrs. Henderson didn't like feeling judged, especially by a 9-year-old. Frank Henderson joined the conversation when Patricia got off the phone. He'd overheard bits and pieces and he reinforced his wife's views. He talked about how kids today were coddled, how they needed to learn respect for authority, how this whole social justice movement had gone too far. He said Patricia was probably too nice to these kids, that she should be stricter, not softer. What neither of them seemed to understand, what they couldn't see, was that this was exactly the problem. Mrs. Henderson genuinely believed she wasn't racist. She would have been horrified if someone called her racist. She'd taught black students before. She'd voted for Barack Obama. She considered herself progressive, open-minded, fair. But she had unconscious biases she refused to examine. When she looked at a white student struggling with an answer, she saw potential that needed nurturing. When she looked at a black student struggling, she saw deficiency that confirmed low expectations. When a white student spoke up confidently, she saw leadership. When a black student did the same, she saw disrespect. These weren't conscious thoughts. They were automatic assumptions buried so deep she didn't even recognize them. The irony was that Mrs. Henderson actually was a caring teacher in many ways. She stayed after school to help students who needed extra support, though those students were disproportionately white. She organized field trips and brought in guest speakers. She'd won teaching awards. Former students, mostly white, wrote her glowing thank you notes that she kept in a special album. But the previous year, during her annual teaching evaluation, there had been a note about concerns regarding cultural sensitivity. The evaluator had observed her class and noticed patterns of differential treatment. They'd suggested professional development on implicit bias and culturally responsive teaching. Mrs. Henderson had dismissed it as political correctness, as the school bowing to pressure from diversity consultants. She'd done the minimum required training, sat through it with her arms crossed and learned nothing. Now, sitting in her living room with her wine and her righteous indignation, Mrs. Henderson made a decision. She decided that Maya Richardson needed to be put in her place before she became a real problem child. Mrs. Henderson had seen it before, students who got it in their heads that they were special, that they deserved special treatment, that they could question authority. Those students, in her experience, needed firm boundaries. They needed to learn respect. She had no idea that the quiet 9-year-old girl she was dismissing as a troublemaker was actually the daughter of a billionaire. She had no idea that Maya had been documenting her behavior with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. She had no idea that she'd given Maya exactly what Maya had asked for. A chance to apologize, a chance to recognize her behavior and make it right. Mrs. Henderson had refused that chance. And now, the consequences were going to unfold in ways she never anticipated. See, this is what makes this story so complex and honestly so realistic. Mrs. Henderson isn't a cartoon villain. She's not twirling a mustache and cackling about her evil plans. She's a real person with real blind spots, someone who genuinely believes she's doing the right thing while perpetuating harm. She's scared of changing times, defensive about her legacy, and completely unwilling to examine her own biases. And that, in many ways, makes her more dangerous than someone who's consciously malicious. Because how do you fight someone who doesn't even believe they're doing anything wrong? How do you address discrimination when the discriminator is convinced they're being fair? That's the challenge Maya was facing. Not just proving that discrimination happened, but helping people see patterns they'd trained themselves not to notice. The next day at school, Wednesday, the tension was palpable. Word had spread about the classroom confrontation and the principal's office meeting. Students whispered in hallways. Some looked at Maya with admiration. Others avoided her completely, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd challenged a teacher so directly. Tyler Banks approached Maya at lunch, something he'd never done before. Tyler kept to himself, mostly wary of getting too close to anyone. But he'd been in that classroom. He'd heard Mrs. Henderson's comment to Maya. And he'd experienced similar treatment for 2 years. Tyler asked Maya if what he'd heard was true, if she'd really documented 7 incidents. Maya confirmed it. Tyler's expression was hard to read, somewhere between hope and cynicism. He told Maya that his mother had complained about Mrs. Henderson last year. Nothing had happened. The principal had told Tyler's mom that Tyler was too sensitive and needed to learn to take constructive criticism. Maya listened, adding this information to her mental file. Tyler asked what Maya thought she could accomplish. He'd learned from experience that nothing ever changed. It never did. The system protected itself. Teachers backed each other up. Administrators wanted to avoid conflict. Kids like them, black kids at a predominantly white school, were supposed to just accept things and not make waves. Maya looked at Tyler and said something that surprised him. "It will change this time." Tyler was skeptical. "What? Because you said so?" Maya's response was quiet but certain. "Because I'm not asking any more." Before Tyler could respond, Jenny Morrison joined them at the lunch table. This was unusual. Jenny came from old money, from a family whose name was literally on buildings at the school. She wasn't someone who usually sat with the outsiders. But Jenny had been in that classroom too. She'd watched Mrs. Henderson ignore Maya's raised hand. She'd heard the implication in Mrs. Henderson's comment about Maya's answer being rehearsed. Jenny admitted something that clearly cost her courage to say. She'd seen everything. She'd noticed the differential treatment for a while now but had stayed silent. Her father had always told her not to rock the boat, to maintain good relationships, to be diplomatic. But Jenny was tired. Tired of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. What Maya didn't know was that her quiet resistance, her careful documentation, her willingness to stand up, was creating a ripple effect. Sophie had started a group chat called The Truth, with students from their grade. What had started as a way to support Maya had evolved into something bigger. Students were sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment. Not just racial issues, though those were prominent. Also sexist comments from a gym teacher. Ableist remarks from a substitute. Ethnic stereotypes casually dropped in lessons. The conversation was opening eyes, creating solidarity, making students realize they weren't alone in feeling like something was wrong with how things worked at Westbrook Academy. But while students were finding their voices, the adults were circling the wagons. Principal Ashford had spoken to Mrs. Henderson privately, and while he'd expressed some concern about Maya's documentation, his primary message was one of support for his veteran teacher. He was worried about the optics, worried about potential complaints, but he was also deeply invested in protecting the school's reputation and avoiding conflict. The stage was set. Maya had given the principal until Friday to address the issue properly. They gave him 3 days. Friday was approaching fast, and Principal Ashford hadn't done anything except have a vague conversation with Mrs. Henderson that amounted to "be careful." Maya knew this. She'd been watching, waiting, documenting the inaction just as carefully as she'd documented the initial discrimination. She'd hoped the system would work. She'd given it every chance. But she was also prepared for what would happen if it didn't. Because Maya Richardson had learned something important from her parents. Hope is not a strategy. You hope for the best, absolutely. You give people chances to do the right thing. But you also prepare for the moment when hope isn't enough, when chances run out, when you have to fight. And if you want to see what happens when a 9-year-old girl who's been underestimated her entire life decides it's time to fight, you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button right now. Because the next part of this story is when Maya stops waiting for adults to fix the problem and starts handling it herself. Trust me, you don't want to miss what she does next. Friday was coming. The deadline Maya had set was approaching. Principal Ashford thought he was dealing with a precocious child who'd eventually back down. Mrs. Henderson thought she'd weathered the storm and could return to business as usual. Even some of Maya's supporters, like Sophie and Tyler, weren't sure what Maya could actually accomplish. None of them understood what was about to happen. None of them knew that Maya Richardson wasn't just a 4th grader with a complaint. She was a strategist who'd been trained by 2 people who'd built an empire by outthinking everyone who underestimated them. The game was about to change. And Westbrook Academy had no idea what was coming. Thursday morning arrived at Westbrook Academy, and if you could bottle tension and sell it, you could have made a fortune in those hallways. Everyone knew something was happening. The whispers had spread like wildfire. Maya Richardson had challenged Mrs. Henderson. There'd been a meeting in the principal's office. An ultimatum had been given. And now, students were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The thing about injustice is that it's rarely isolated. It's like pulling on a loose thread in a sweater. You think you're dealing with one small problem, but once you start pulling, you realize the whole thing is unraveling. Maya was about to discover that her situation with Mrs. Henderson wasn't just about her. It was about a pattern of behavior that had affected students for years. And once people felt safe enough to speak up, once someone had been brave enough to go first, the story started pouring out. It started at lunch. Maya was sitting at her usual table with Sophie when Tyler Banks approached them. Now, Tyler approaching anyone was unusual. Tyler kept to himself. He'd learned early in his time at Westbrook Academy that keeping his head down, not drawing attention, not making waves, was the safest strategy for survival. But something about what Maya had done, the way she'd stood up in that classroom, the way she documented everything with such precision, had given Tyler something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Tyler sat down across from Maya and Sophie, his lunch tray clattering slightly against the table. He looked at Maya for a long moment, like he was trying to decide if he could trust her. Then he started talking. Tyler told them his story. He'd been dealing with Mrs. Henderson's comments for 2 years now. 2 full years. It had started in 3rd grade, almost from his first day in her class. The subtle dismissals. The different standards. The microaggressions that were small enough that he couldn't quite name them but large enough that they accumulated, weighing on him day after day. Tyler described how Mrs. Henderson would compliment white students for effort even when they got wrong answers. But with him, anything less than perfection was met with disappointment. How she'd suggest he might be better suited for vocational programs rather than advanced placement, despite his straight-A average. How she'd once pulled him aside and suggested he spend less time on extracurriculars, and more time studying, making an assumption that he played basketball when Tyler had never touched a basketball in his life. He was in the robotics club and the debate team. Tyler's mother had complained. She'd gone to Principal Ashford last year, armed with her own observations and Tyler's experiences. She'd asked for Tyler to be moved to a different class. She'd requested that someone look into whether Mrs. Henderson's grading was fair and unbiased. And what had happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Principal Ashford had listened politely. He'd thanked Tyler's mother for her concerns. And then he'd told her that Mrs. Henderson was one of their most experienced teachers, that perhaps Tyler was being too sensitive, that constructive criticism was important for growth, and that moving students around because of personality conflicts set a bad precedent. Tyler's mother, a single parent working 2 jobs to afford even the reduced tuition Tyler received through his scholarship, didn't have the energy or resources to fight the school. She told Tyler to work hard, keep his head down, and prove them wrong through excellence. And Tyler had tried. But excellence, he was learning, wasn't always enough when the system was designed to overlook you. Tyler looked at Maya with eyes that held too much cynicism for a 10-year-old and said, "Nothing's going to change. It never does." Maya met his gaze steadily. "It will this time." Tyler let out a bitter laugh. "Why? Because you said so?" And Maya, with that same calm certainty she'd shown in the principal's office, replied, "Because I'm not asking any more." There was something in the way she said it that made Tyler pause. Maya wasn't pleading. She wasn't hoping. She was stating a fact. She'd given the system a chance to work through official channels, through polite requests and documented complaints. That chance was almost up. And when it expired, Maya was prepared to do something else. Tyler didn't know what that something was, but he could see the determination in her eyes. Before Tyler could respond, something unexpected happened. Jenny Morrison approached their table, her lunch tray in hand, looking nervous but determined. Now, Jenny Morrison sitting at their table was shocking. Jenny came from a family that had been at Westbrook Academy for generations. Her grandfather had a library named after him. Her father was on the board of trustees. Jenny was popular, well-liked, the kind of student teachers adored. She had everything to lose by associating herself with what some students were already calling Maya's rebellion. But Jenny sat down anyway. She looked at Maya and said something that took real courage. "I've seen everything. I've noticed the different treatment for months. And I felt guilty for staying silent." Sophie, Maya, and Tyler all stared at her. Jenny continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She talked about how her father had always told her not to rock the boat, to be diplomatic, to maintain good relationships, to understand that getting along was more important than being right. Jenny had internalized these lessons her whole life. She'd watched unfairness happen and convinced herself it wasn't her place to intervene, that someone else would handle it, that maybe she was misunderstanding the situation. But Jenny was tired. Tired of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Tired of the guilt that kept her up at night. Tired of being complicit through her silence. "My dad says you don't rock the boat," Jenny said. "But I'm tired of pretending everything is fine." And just like that, the group at the table went from 3 to 4. But it didn't stop there. Over the next 20 minutes, other students began to drift over. Some Maya knew, some she didn't. They were a diverse group. White students, black students, Asian students, Latino students. Some were scholarship kids like Tyler, others came from wealth like Jenny. But they all had one thing in common. They'd experienced or witnessed something at Westbrook Academy that wasn't right, and Maya's willingness to stand up had given them permission to speak. Sophie revealed something she'd been working on. She'd started a group chat called The Truth, with students from their grade. What had begun as a way to support Maya had evolved into something much bigger. Students were sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment, and the stories were eye-opening. A girl named Priya talked about how Mr. Johnson, the gym teacher, made comments about girls needing to work off those cookies, while never commenting on boys' bodies. How he'd rank the girls on their appearance during dance units and make jokes about it. A boy named David, who used a wheelchair, shared how substitute teachers would talk to his aide instead of to him, as if his mobility issues affected his hearing or intelligence. How the school's accessible features were often broken or blocked, and complaints about it were met with, "We'll get to it eventually." Maria described how Mrs. Patterson, the Spanish teacher, would make her translate for the class and perform her ethnicity, putting her on the spot to represent all Latinx people, while never asking white students to speak for their entire race. The stories kept coming. Some were about Mrs. Henderson, but many weren't. This wasn't just about one teacher. It was about systemic issues, patterns of behavior, institutional problems that had been allowed to persist because no one had ever organized to address them before. Maya listened to all of it, and something shifted in her understanding. She thought she was fighting for herself, for Tyler, for the handful of black students in Mrs. Henderson's class. But this was bigger. This was about creating a school environment where every student felt valued, respected, and treated fairly. This was about changing a culture, not just addressing one teacher's bias. The group decided to formalize their organization. They'd continue meeting, continue sharing stories, continue supporting each other. Sophie suggested they compile all the experiences, create a document that showed patterns across the school. Maya agreed, but warned them to be careful. To document everything. To stick to facts. To be prepared for pushback. What none of them noticed was Brock Wellington sitting 2 tables away, his phone out, texting rapidly. Brock had been watching the growing group with increasing alarm. His father, the state senator, had always taught him that order and hierarchy were important. That students who challenged authority were troublemakers. That maintaining the status quo was essential. Brock didn't understand what he was witnessing. He didn't see students finding their voices. He saw rebellion, disruption, danger. And he did what he'd been taught to do. He reported it to authority. Brock left the cafeteria and went straight to Mrs. Henderson's classroom. She was there grading papers during her lunch period. Brock told her about the group forming around Maya, about the group chat, about students sharing complaints about teachers. He painted it as a conspiracy, a coordinated attack on the school's faculty. Mrs. Henderson listened, her expression growing more troubled and more defensive with each detail. She saw this exactly the way Brock presented it, not as students advocating for themselves, but as a problem that needed to be contained. And in her mind, the source of the problem was clear. Maya Richardson. The girl who'd challenged her in class, who'd documented incidents, who'd given the principal an ultimatum. Maya was the ringleader, the troublemaker who was now corrupting other students, turning them against their teachers. Mrs. Henderson made a decision. She was going to escalate this. She was going to call Maya's parents and make them understand that their daughter was becoming a serious problem. That her behavior was disruptive and disrespectful. That she was creating division in the school. Mrs. Henderson convinced herself she was doing the right thing, protecting the school, maintaining order, addressing a problem before it got worse. She pulled up Maya's file on her computer and found the emergency contact information. There was a cell phone number listed for Maya's mother. Mrs. Henderson dialed it, rehearsing in her mind exactly what she was going to say. She expected to reach a concerned parent who would be horrified to learn about their daughter's behavior, who would promise to address it at home, who would support the teacher in re-establishing appropriate boundaries. What she got was something entirely different. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. "This is Claudia Richardson." The voice was professional, calm, with an undertone of warmth. Mrs. Henderson launched into her prepared speech. She introduced herself as Maya's teacher and said she was calling about some concerning behavior. She explained that Maya had been disruptive in class, disrespectful to authority, and was now creating division among students. She painted Maya as a problem child who needed to be reined in before her behavior escalated further. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Claudia Richardson spoke and her voice had changed. It was still calm, still professional, but now there was steel underneath. "That doesn't sound like my daughter. What specifically happened?" Mrs. Henderson found herself wrong-footed. She'd expected immediate parental concern and support. Instead, she was being asked for specifics. She tried to maintain control of the conversation, describing how Maya had questioned her judgment in class, had implied inappropriate behavior, had given the principal an ultimatum. She made it sound like Maya was out of control, insubordinate, a ringleader of student unrest. Claudia listened without interrupting. When Mrs. Henderson finished, there was another pause. Then Claudia said, "I'd like to meet. Tomorrow, 3 p.m.? Mrs. Henderson agreed immediately, feeling confident. Finally, she'd have parental backup. She'd sit down with Maya's mother, explain the situation properly, and they'd come up with a plan to address Maya's behavior together. She hung up feeling like she'd regained control of the situation. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that Claudia Richardson had been in the middle of volunteering at the hospital when she took the call. She was in her doctor's coat, having just finished checking on a patient. And the moment she hung up with Mrs. Henderson, her entire demeanor changed. Claudia stepped into an empty consultation room and immediately placed a video call. The connection took a moment, but then Marcus Richardson's face appeared on screen. He was in a hotel room in Tokyo, wearing a suit but with his tie loosened. It was early morning there and he'd been preparing for a series of meetings. But the moment he saw Claudia's expression, he gave her his full attention. Claudia didn't waste time. She told him about the call from Maya's teacher. About the allegations of disruptive behavior and disrespect. Marcus's expression darkened, but he stayed silent, listening as Claudia spoke. Their conversation revealed everything about their parenting philosophy. They'd raised Maya to advocate for herself. They believed in letting her fight her own battles when it was safe to do so. They wanted her to develop agency, to learn that she had power, to understand that she didn't need to wait for adults to fix every problem. But they were also fiercely protective. They knew when to step back and when to intervene. And a teacher calling to complain about their 9-year-old daughter being disruptive and disrespectful? That was a red flag suggesting intervention might be necessary. Marcus asked if he should fly back. He could cancel his meetings, be on a plane in 3 hours, be home by tomorrow morning. His voice made it clear he was ready to drop everything. Claudia considered it. "Not yet. Let's see what Maya's been dealing with first. I have a meeting tomorrow at 3. Let me talk to our daughter tonight and figure out what's really going on." Marcus nodded, but his jaw was tight. "Call me after you talk to Maya. I want to know everything." They ended the call, and Claudia stood in that consultation room for a moment, collecting herself. She knew her daughter. Maya was thoughtful, brilliant, kind, and strategic. If a teacher was calling to complain about Maya's behavior, there was more to the story. Much more. That evening, Claudia came home from the hospital earlier than usual. She found Maya in her room, sitting at her desk, working on homework with an intensity that suggested she was using it to avoid thinking about something else. Claudia knocked gently on the doorframe and asked if they could talk. Maya looked up, and for a brief moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped. She could see in her mother's eyes that Claudia knew something. That the conversation they'd been avoiding was about to happen. They sat together on Maya's bed and Claudia asked directly, "Your teacher called me today. She said you've been disruptive and disrespectful. Want to tell me what's really going on?" And that's when Maya finally broke. Not from weakness but from relief. The weight she'd been carrying alone, the fear and the anger and the determination, all of it came pouring out. She cried, and these weren't quiet, controlled tears. These were the tears of a 9-year-old child who'd been trying so hard to be strong, to handle everything herself, to prove she didn't need help. Tears of relief that she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Between sobs, Maya told her mother everything. She showed Claudia the documentation she'd compiled. The notebook. The recordings. The spreadsheets tracking differential treatment. The photos of vandalized lockers. Every incident, every microaggression, every moment of bias that she'd endured while maintaining her composure at school. Claudia sat there, looking through her daughter's meticulous work, and her heart was breaking and swelling with pride simultaneously. Breaking because her baby had been dealing with this for months and hadn't felt like she could come to her parents. Breaking because Maya had experienced discrimination that no child should have to face. Breaking because Maya had felt like she needed to be strong enough to handle it alone. But also swelling with pride because Maya had done everything right. She'd documented. She'd stayed calm. She'd given people chances to do the right thing. She'd been strategic and thoughtful and brave. She was exactly the person Claudia and Marcus had raised her to be. Claudia pulled Maya close and said, "Baby, you did everything right. But you don't have to do this alone." Maya's response came out muffled against her mother's shoulder, "I wanted to be strong like you and Dad." Claudia pulled back, looking directly into her daughter's eyes. "Strength isn't doing everything alone. It's knowing when to ask for help. Your father built an empire, but he had partners, investors, employees, mentors. I became a neurosurgeon, but I had colleagues, teachers, support systems. We've never done anything completely alone, and neither should you." They talked for over an hour. Claudia asked questions, listened to Maya's experiences, validated her feelings, and helped her process what she'd been going through. Then they started creating a plan together. Not Claudia taking over, but mother and daughter strategizing as a team. Claudia explained that she had a meeting tomorrow at 3 with Mrs. Henderson. She asked Maya what she wanted to accomplish. Not what Claudia wanted, not what Marcus would want, but what Maya herself hoped for as an outcome. Maya thought about it carefully. She said she didn't want Mrs. Henderson fired, not necessarily. What she wanted was for Mrs. Henderson to understand what she'd been doing wrong. For the school to implement real changes. For other students not to have to go through what she'd experienced. She wanted justice, but she also wanted growth and education. Claudia nodded, impressed by her daughter's maturity and clarity. They discussed strategy. How to present the documentation. What to demand from the school. How to use the meeting to create real change. Then Maya asked the question that had been on her mind, "Are you going to tell them who we are?" Claudia smiled, a fierce expression that reminded Maya exactly where she'd gotten her own determination. "Not yet. Let's see how they handle this when they think we're just another black family." And there it was. The strategic brilliance that ran in the Richardson family. They could reveal Marcus's identity, could use his wealth and influence to immediately change the power dynamics. But doing that would obscure an important truth. It would make the school's response about money and power rather than about right and wrong. It would let them off the hook for how they treated students who didn't have billionaire parents. No, Claudia wanted to see how Principal Ashford and Mrs. Henderson handled this situation when they thought they were dealing with an average black family. She wanted to see if they would do the right thing because it was right, not because they were afraid of losing a major donor. The plan was set. Tomorrow's meeting was going to be very different from what Mrs. Henderson was expecting. Now, before we get to that meeting, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between using your privilege or power to solve a problem quickly, versus handling it the hard way to prove a point about fairness? It's a real dilemma that a lot of people face. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what the Richardsons are about to do is going to force everyone at Westbrook Academy to confront some uncomfortable truths about how they treat people based on assumptions about their background and resources. That night, Maya slept better than she had in months. Not because the problem was solved, but because she wasn't carrying the burden alone anymore. She had her mother in her corner. She had her father ready to fly home at a moment's notice. She had Sophie and Tyler and Jenny and a growing group of students who were finding their voices. She had documentation that was irrefutable. She had a strategy. Friday morning arrived, and it was the deadline Maya had given Principal Ashford. He hadn't addressed the issue properly. He'd done the bare minimum, having one conversation with Mrs. Henderson that amounted to a gentle warning to be careful. He'd hoped the problem would go away on its own, that Maya would back down, that he could avoid confrontation and maintain the status quo. Principal Ashford had no idea that today, everything was going to change. He didn't know about the meeting scheduled for 3 p.m. He didn't know about Maya's documentation. He didn't know who Maya's parents really were. He didn't know that his careful avoidance of the problem had just made it exponentially worse. Mrs. Henderson went through her Friday morning classes feeling vindicated. She'd called Maya's parents. She'd taken action. She'd regained control. This afternoon she'd meet with Maya's mother, explain the situation, and they'd address Maya's behavior together. Everything would return to normal. She had no idea she was about to walk into a meeting that would change her life forever. And if you want to see what happens when a former neurosurgeon and a 9-year-old girl with impeccable documentation walk into a meeting with a teacher who's been underestimating them, you absolutely need to subscribe right now, because the next part of this story is when everything the school thought they knew gets turned completely upside down. Trust me, you do not want to miss this. 3 p.m. was approaching. The players were all in position. The documentation was compiled. The strategy was set. And Westbrook Academy was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the cost of ignoring injustice, about the danger of underestimating people, and about what happens when a family that has built their entire legacy on fighting systemic barriers decides it's time to fight again. The confrontation was coming. And it was going to be devastating. The conference room feels smaller than it should. Principal Ashford sits at the head of the table, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile perfectly practiced. Mrs. Henderson settles into her chair with the confidence of someone who's won these meetings before. 30 years of teaching has taught her the script, taught her which words carry weight with administrators. Classroom management. Disruption. Insubordination. She knows the language. Claudia sits with a leather portfolio in front of her, her expression giving nothing away. Maya is beside her, hands folded on the table, watching. Just watching. Mrs. Henderson glances at the door one more time. She'd been told Marcus Richardson might attend. The billionaire tech mogul. She'd researched him last night, preparing different talking points, a different tone. But he's not coming. There's a flicker of something across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or relief. It's hard to tell. Principal Ashford clears his throat. Well, shall we begin? Mrs. Henderson, would you like to present your perspective? And she does. Oh, she does. She talks about classroom dynamics and authority structures. She uses words like precocious and challenging when describing Maya. She never says the girl is difficult, she's too smart for that, but the implication hangs in the air like smoke. She paints a picture of a student who questions too much, who doesn't understand that sometimes you just need to follow the rules, who makes things harder than they need to be. I've been teaching for 30 years, Mrs. Henderson says, and those words are meant to be armor. I've taught hundreds of children. I know the difference between a student who needs guidance and one who needs boundaries. Principal Ashford nods along. He's already decided how this ends. He's already mentally drafting the email he'll send to the Richardsons. Professional, sympathetic, ultimately dismissive. Teachers have academic freedom. Mrs. Henderson is tenured. Sometimes personalities just don't mesh. Perhaps a different class next semester? Claudia takes notes. Her pen moves steadily across the page, recording every word, every justification, every excuse. She doesn't interrupt. She doesn't object. She just listens. When Mrs. Henderson finishes, there's a pause. Principal Ashford looks at Claudia expectantly. Thank you for that context, Mrs. Henderson, Claudia says, and her voice is professional, courteous even. I'd like to walk through some specific incidents if that's all right. She opens her portfolio. Inside are printed transcripts, time-stamped and dated. She goes through them methodically, surgically. The first time Mrs. Henderson dismissed Maya's raised hand. The second time. The fifth time. The comment about not all history being appropriate for discussion. The group project where Maya's leadership was called bossy. Each incident, isolated, could be explained away. But together? Together they form a pattern. Mrs. Henderson, Claudia says, Maya also made some recordings. With your permission, Principal Ashford, I'd like to play them. The principal shifts in his seat. He doesn't want to hear recordings. Recordings make things complicated. But he nods because refusing would look worse. Claudia presses play on her phone. The audio quality is surprisingly clear. Maya's voice asking a question about the Reconstruction era. Mrs. Henderson's response, clipped and dismissive, we'll get to that if we have time, Maya. Then moments later, a white student asks about the same period. Mrs. Henderson's voice transforms, warm, encouraging. That's an excellent question, Emma. Let's explore that together. The difference is stark. Undeniable. Principal Ashford's face changes. This isn't a personality conflict. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is evidence. Claudia plays another recording. Mrs. Henderson's voice talking to Tyler Johnson. Maybe if you spent less time on basketball and more on books, you'd understand this better. There's a beat of silence in the conference room. Tyler doesn't play basketball, Maya says quietly. He's in the robotics club. He has a 4.0 GPA. Mrs. Henderson's face drains of color. That was taken out of context. What context makes that appropriate? Claudia asks. The teacher's composure cracks. This is entrapment. You can't just record people without their knowledge. What kind of parent teaches their child to spy? The word hangs there. Spy. As if documenting discrimination is espionage. As if protecting yourself is betrayal. Claudia's voice stays level, but there's steel underneath now. The kind of parent who teaches her daughter to document injustice when authority figures refuse to address it. Mrs. Henderson's eyes well with tears. It happens fast. One moment she's defensive, the next she's the victim. I've dedicated my life to education, she says, voice trembling. 30 years. I've given everything to this school, to these students. And this is how I'm treated? Ambushed? Recorded like some criminal? It's a masterful pivot. Suddenly she's not the teacher who made assumptions about a black boy in basketball. She's the veteran educator being attacked by an overzealous parent. Principal Ashford, always searching for the path of least resistance, seizes on it. Perhaps, he says carefully, this situation would benefit from mediation. A neutral third party where everyone can share their feelings and… Mr. Ashford. Maya's voice cuts through the room. It's the first time she's spoken since the meeting started, and something about her tone makes everyone stop. This isn't a misunderstanding, she says. She's looking directly at the principal now, and her gaze is steady, unflinching. This is a pattern. I documented it because I needed you to see the pattern. She pauses and the silence is heavy. I gave Mrs. Henderson a chance to apologize when I came to her directly. She chose not to. I gave you a chance to address it when I reported it to your office. You chose to wait to hope it would go away. Now we're here. Principal Ashford opens his mouth, his administrator voice kicking in, the voice that's meant to sound reasonable and measured. Maya, I understand you're upset, but we need to approach this with… I'm not upset, sir. Maya's interruption is polite but firm. I'm disappointed. There's a difference. The distinction lands like a punch. Before the principal can respond, Claudia stands. She closes her portfolio with a decisive snap. I think we're done here. Mrs. Richardson, Principal Ashford says quickly, rising from his chair, I assure you we take these matters very seriously. We'll conduct a full review, interview students, examine. Do you know who my husband is, Mr. Ashford? The question stops him mid-sentence. For the first time, there's uncertainty in his expression. The kind of uncertainty that comes when you realize you've miscalculated badly. Marcus Richardson, Claudia says. Richardson Technologies. Your largest donor, I believe. The science wing? The new computer lab? The scholarship fund. The air seems to leave the room. Mrs. Henderson's face goes from pale to gray. Principal Ashford's mouth opens and closes like a fish. I had no idea Maya was… Claudia cuts him off, and there's something dangerous in her calm now. Why would that matter, Mr. Ashford? Should only children of billionaires be treated with respect in your school? Should only students whose parents can fund entire wings of buildings deserve to be heard when they report discrimination? She lets the questions hang there, unanswered, because there is no good answer. My daughter, Claudia continues, wanted to handle this the right way. She didn't come to me first, even though she could have. She didn't ask me to make phone calls or pull strings. She documented. She reported. She followed your process. She believed in your process. Each sentence is precise, cutting. And you failed her. Principal Ashford's voice is desperate now, the careful administrator mask cracking. Mrs. Richardson, please, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone. Perhaps a meeting with the superintendent, or if Maya would be more comfortable in a different class. He's scrambling, trying to contain this before it explodes into something he can't manage. Before phone calls are made to the school board. Before donors start asking questions. Maya reaches out and tugs her mother's sleeve. It's a small gesture, gentle. Mom, she says quietly. Stick to the plan. Claudia looks down at her daughter, and something passes between them. An understanding, a reminder. She nods and sits back down. The shift in the room's energy is palpable. Principal Ashford and Mrs. Henderson exchange confused glances. This isn't how this was supposed to go. The revelation of Maya's family wealth was supposed to be the climax, the threat, the hammer coming down. Maya takes over and her voice is clear, measured, far older than 12. Mr. Ashford, we're not here to get anyone fired. Everyone looks surprised. Mrs. Henderson most of all. We're here, Maya continues, because this school needs to change. Mrs. Henderson is a symptom, not the disease. She folds her hands on the table, mirroring her mother's posture. You have implicit bias training once a year for 2 hours where teachers watch videos and check boxes. You have a diversity statement on your website that no one reads. You have policies about discrimination that sound good on paper but don't protect students when they need protecting. And here's where I need you to do something. If you're finding this story as powerful as I hope you are, if Maya's journey is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button. Because this is a story that needs to be told, and there are more stories like it that need to be shared. Maya leans forward slightly. I could have had my parents transfer me to another school. A private school where they treat me well because of who my father is. But that doesn't fix anything. That just means the next black student who doesn't have those resources, who doesn't have that protection, faces the same thing I did. Principal Ashford is listening now, really listening in a way he wasn't before. So here's what we want, Maya says. And the fact that she says, we, that she includes herself in the demands, in the solution, shifts something fundamental in the room. This isn't a child being rescued by her parents. This is a child leading. But before we get to those demands, I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about it. If Maya didn't have the resources she had, the supportive parents, the ability to document everything, the family name that made people pay attention, what would have happened to her? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because that question, that uncomfortable question, is at the heart of everything. The meeting isn't over. The confrontation isn't finished. But the power in the room has shifted completely. It's not in Principal Ashford's hands anymore. It's not in Mrs. Henderson's 30 years of experience. It's not even entirely in Claudia's wealth and connections. It's in a 12-year-old girl who refused to be invisible, who documented injustice, who followed the rules even when the rules were designed to dismiss her, and who now sits at that conference table not as a victim to be pitied, but as an agent of change to be reckoned with. Because Maya Richardson didn't just want an apology. She wanted transformation. And she was about to tell them exactly what that looked like. Maya reaches into her backpack and pulls out a document. It's typed, printed, stapled in the corner, professional. Claudia helped with the formatting, with making sure the language was clear and actionable, but every idea on those pages came from a 12-year-old girl who'd spent weeks thinking about what justice actually looks like. She slides it across the table to Principal Ashford. These are our terms, Maya says. The principal picks up the document with hesitant hands, like it might bite him. Mrs. Henderson leans over to read along, and as their eyes scan down the page, you can see their expressions shift from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. Maya's voice is steady as she walks them through it. First, mandatory implicit bias training for all staff. Not the optional sensitivity training you do now where people can skip out if they have a scheduling conflict. Real training. From experts. With accountability. Principal Ashford opens his mouth, probably to say something about budgets or logistics, but Maya keeps going. Second, a student committee on equity and inclusion. Not a symbolic thing where kids put up posters during Black History Month. A committee with real power. We review policies. We advise on hiring. We have a voice in decisions that affect us. Mrs. Henderson's face is pale now, reading ahead, seeing where this is going. Third, an anonymous reporting system for discrimination. Because not every student has parents who can come to meetings like this. Not every student has the resources I have. They need a way to report that's safe, that's actually reviewed, that leads to actual consequences. Fourth, regular climate surveys. You need to know what's happening in your school, not what you want to believe is happening. Fifth, diversification of curriculum and staff. One Black History unit in February isn't enough. One Latino Heritage celebration in September isn't enough. And students need to see teachers who look like them, who understand their experiences, who can mentor them. She pauses, lets those 5 points sink in. Principal Ashford is nodding slowly, mechanically, already calculating how to spin this to the school board, how to make it look like his idea. But Maya isn't done. And regarding Mrs. Henderson specifically, the teacher goes very still. A formal apology. To me, to Tyler Johnson, and to any other students she's affected. Not a, sorry if you were offended, apology. A real one. Maya's finger moves down the page. Completion of intensive bias training. Not the 2-hour video. Real work. With a professional. Who will report on her progress. 6 months of probation with regular classroom observations. Someone watching to make sure the changes are real, not just performance. She looks up now, makes eye contact with Mrs. Henderson. And if one more incident occurs, even one, immediate termination. The room is silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Mrs. Henderson, Maya says, and her voice is softer now but no less firm, you have a choice. You can accept these terms and do the work to become a better teacher. Or you can resign. But you can't keep teaching the way you have been. That option is off the table. Mrs. Henderson's hands are shaking. She looks at the document, at Maya, at Principal Ashford, back to the document. When she speaks, her voice cracks. This will ruin my reputation. 30 years of teaching and this is how it ends? With probation and monitoring like I'm some kind of criminal? Your actions were already ruining your reputation, Maya says, and there's no cruelty in it, just truth. This gives you a chance to rebuild it. To do better. To be better. The moment stretches out. Mrs. Henderson's breathing is audible. You can see the war happening inside her. Between ego and growth, between defensiveness and accountability, between the easy path of walking away with her pride intact and the hard path of admitting she was wrong and doing the work to change. Her shoulders slump. I accept, she whispers. And then she's crying. But these tears are different from the performative ones earlier. These aren't tears of manipulation or self-pity. These are the tears of someone whose entire self-image is cracking open, someone who's being forced to see herself clearly for the first time in years, maybe ever. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson says, and she's looking at Maya now, really looking at her. Truly, I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. There's a long pause. Maya could twist the knife here. She could list every microaggression, every dismissal, every moment of pain. She's earned that right. Instead, she says, but now you do. That's a start. If you're watching this and thinking about the courage it takes to stand up like Maya did, to demand accountability and still offer grace, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this, stories about the hard work of justice and the complicated reality of change, these are the stories we need more of. Principal Ashford clears his throat. His voice is smaller than it was at the start of this meeting. We'll implement all of these recommendations. I'll present them to the school board next week. We'll formalize everything. He doesn't say it, but everyone in the room knows. He has no choice. Marcus Richardson's name is on buildings. Marcus Richardson's donations fund programs. Marcus Richardson could make one phone call and Principal Ashford's career would be over. But that's not why this is happening. This is happening because a 12-year-old girl documented injustice, followed the process, and refused to be silent when that process failed her. The meeting ends not with a bang but with signatures. Papers are signed. Timelines are established. Follow-up meetings are scheduled. It's bureaucratic and administrative and nothing like the triumphant movie moments where evil is vanquished and music swells. But it's real. And real change rarely looks like the movies. 2 months pass. The hallways of Ashland Academy look mostly the same, but if you pay attention, if you really look, you can see the differences. There's a new display in the main corridor highlighting student voices on equity. The morning announcements now include a diversity thought of the week. Small things. Ripples. And there's a new teacher. Mr. James Coleman. 6th grade mathematics. He's young, early 30s with a warm smile and an easy rapport with students. He's also the first black male teacher at Ashland Academy in over a decade. Mrs. Henderson is still there, still teaching 5th grade history. But she's different. Quieter. More careful. She asks more questions now and talks less. She listens when students share perspectives that differ from her own. She's not perfect. Perfection isn't the goal and never was. But she's trying. Actually trying. The Student Equity Committee holds its first official meeting after school on a Tuesday. Maya sits at the head of the table, not because she demanded the position but because her classmates voted her there unanimously. Tyler Johnson is vice chair, his 4.0 GPA and robotics expertise now properly recognized. Sophie Chin is secretary, her organizational skills finally appreciated. Jenny Martinez is there too, no longer sitting silent in the back of the classroom. And in a twist no one expected, Brock Wellington shows up. He slides into a seat near the back, looking uncomfortable but curious. When Maya raises her eyebrows at him, he shrugs. Figured I should probably learn some stuff, he mutters. They're tackling dress code inequity next. The way black girls get sent home for hairstyles that white girls never get questioned about. The way the professionalism standards seem to have a racial double standard baked in. It's complicated work. Uncomfortable work. But it's necessary work. In the hallway after the meeting, Maya and Mrs. Henderson pass each other. There's an awkward moment where neither knows quite what to say. The hurt is still there. The history doesn't vanish just because papers were signed and promises were made. Then Mrs. Henderson speaks. That was a good analysis in class today, Maya. Your point about how we can't understand Reconstruction without understanding the economic systems that preceded it, that was insightful. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Maya could let the moment pass. Could just nod and keep walking. Instead, she says, thank you for listening, Mrs. Henderson. It's a small exchange. 30 seconds maybe. But it's the kind of moment that signals something fundamental has shifted. Not fixed, shifted. There's a difference. Outside, James is waiting with the car. Maya slides into the back seat, drops her backpack, exhales. I hear you've been making waves, James says, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. His tone is proud, knowing. Maya grins, tired but satisfied. Just ripples, James. Just ripples. Well, James says, pulling away from the curb, ripples have a way of spreading. Your grandmother understood that. Maya thinks about Grandma Rose. About her journals. About the quiet, persistent way she fought her own battles in a time when the cost of speaking up was even higher than it is now. Yeah, Maya says softly. She did. That evening, the Richardson house is full of life and noise and the smell of Claudia's famous lasagna. Marcus is back from Tokyo, jet-lagged but happy to be home. Caleb, Maya's 6-year-old brother, is explaining his current dinosaur obsession with the kind of enthusiastic detail only a first grader can muster. And the Ankylosaurus had a tail club that could break bones. Caleb announces, wielding his fork like a prehistoric weapon. Eat your vegetables, Ankylosaurus, Claudia says, but she's smiling. It's normal. Beautifully, wonderfully normal. The kind of family dinner that happens in houses all over the world, teasing and laughter and someone asking someone else to pass the salt. Marcus looks at Maya, his eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement. So, he says, I heard my daughter staged a corporate takeover of her elementary school. Maya grins around a mouthful of garlic bread. I learned from the best. Claudia shakes her head fondly. She really did handle it herself. We just backed her up. Marcus leans forward, and his voice is more serious now, though still warm. What did you learn, sweetheart? Maya thinks about it. Really thinks. Because her father doesn't ask throwaway questions. He wants real answers. That standing up for yourself is hard, she says finally. But it's harder to stay silent. She pauses, gathering more thoughts. That people can change if they want to. If they're willing to do the work. Another pause. And that being powerful isn't about money. It's about knowing your worth. Marcus and Claudia exchange a look across the table. It's the kind of look parents share when they realize their child is growing up, understanding things, becoming the person they hoped she would be. Caleb, who has been listening with the intense focus children sometimes surprise you with, pipes up. When I'm 9, can I take over my school too? The tension breaks. Everyone laughs. Real, full family laughter. Maya reaches over and ruffles her little brother's hair. Only if you have to, buddy. Only if you have to. Later that night, after dishes are done and Caleb is in bed and the house has settled into quiet, Maya sits at her desk with her journal. The one that started all of this. The one Grandma Rose would have been proud of. She opens to a fresh page and writes the date at the top. The entry is short, simple, but it captures everything. Today was a good day. Not because I won. Because we all chose to be better. Even the hard way. Especially the hard way. She closes the journal, turns off her light, and the room fades to darkness. Here's my question for you, and I really want to know. What would you have done in Maya's situation? When the adults failed to act, when the system seemed designed to protect the status quo, what would your choice have been? Drop your answer in the comments. Because this isn't just Maya's story, it's a question every one of us might face. This story is inspired by real experiences. The Mayas of the world are in schools right now, navigating systems that weren't built with them in mind, finding courage in impossible situations, choosing to speak up when silence would be easier. Stand up. Speak out. Change the world. One ripple at a time.